Hi everyone, this is part 3 of the last minute revision topic cover of the FRG in History A-Level Edexcel, and this is Economic Development and Policies of the FRG. So we first have what effect did creation of a social market economy have on the Federal Republic from 1945 to 89. So we have how far was economic recovery achieved in the years 1945 to 55. Allies agreed it was important to rebuild Germany's economy, but they also agreed that it was important Germany didn't start another war. So industries considered to be war industries, such as munitions, were banned, and others that were war-related, like chemical industries, had their outputs restricted. The fact that the Reichsmark was also worthless was damaging to the economy. Whilst the black market thrived, it was hard to get workers when their wages hardly bought anything. Transport and communication linked cross zones, hampering economic recovery. The economic and physical devastation in Germany was so great and the occupation so dislocating that some Germans left and others chose not to return. For example, 160,000 German prisoners of war in France stayed there after the war rather than returning to Germany. However, these numbers were far exceeded by the influx of 10 million Germans who came as refugees ahead of the Soviet army or were expelled from Eastern Europe under the reallocation of land and people agreed at the Potsdam Conference. Refugees at first were seen as adding to Germany's troubles, but then became one of Germany's biggest assets. The Allies had to deal with refugees and homelessness Germans and were forced to introduce Germany after 1949, so the relation between the USSR and the West deteriorated rapidly and the Cold War developed. One of the major factors in separation was the economic aid, worth about $1.4 million, given to Western zones under the Marshall Plan in 1948, setting off the creation of the Reichsmark to administer the aid. The new currency helped to stabilise the economy and break up the black market, as the currency is backed up by Western powers. However, it led to Soviet zones setting up its own currency as it wasn't included in the DM, making separation more likely. By the end of 1949, Germany had divided into the FRG and the GDR. Erhard and Reform. Erhard was appointed Director of Economic Administration in March 1948. He believed in the idea of a social market economy and worked to create one under the Allies and then as Economic Minister of Germany from 1949 to 63. On the 18th of June 1948, he announced that the RM would be replaced by the DM on 21st of June. On the 24th of June, the Economic Council gave Erhard the power to abolish almost all but most essential rationing. Wages stay fixed until November 1948 to allow businesses to establish themselves. The combination of the new currency and these measures meant that people stopped hoarding goods and started to sell them. Also, further than buying anything and that became available, they began to shop with more careful concern for the price and quality because they felt more confident that supply would be less erratic. The currency reform only affected cash and monetary savings, where the military government needed taxes on all assets, then the money could be used as compensation to those who lost everything. In 1952, the Bundestag eventually passed the Equalization of Burdens Act, and money raised and redistributed to help many people start again. Erhard's reforms didn't bring immediate economic recovery, for the problems that had to be overcome were great. Factories and businesses could start producing and trading again, but they had to replace machinery and train workers. Some businesses failed after the currency reform, but they could not afford to pay wages. Other businesses managed to keep on going, but they had to lay off some of their workers. Unemployment rose from 442,000 in June 1948 to 937,000 in January 1949. By 1950, it was as high as 1.8 million, but then it began to fall. In 1955, it was 1 million and continued to fall. Car production in 1959 was 4 times greater than in 1950. In the same period, steel production doubled, underlining Germany's new focus on consumer goods. So then we have opposition. So Erhard faced opposition in both the Economic Council and the Bundestag. While his policy of converting from a command economy to a social market economy was not liked. The pre-command economy with cartels and price fixing was what many wanted back. Erhard wanted cartels broken up and price fixing abandoned in favour of competition within industries. Socialists opposed change not to support price fixing, because that's what they wanted, to nationalise industries and use state control, not allowing the capitalist market to set up its own levels. However, the combination capitalist market with a responsible government won Erhard's enough support in the Bundestag to continue his policies, allowing business tax concessions and removing wage restrictions, whilst encouraging the setting up of trade unions to make sure that the workers had adequate representation in wage negotiation. All business workers had worker councils, and in 1951 there was a policy of co-determination, allowing for workers' representation on managerial boards in the industries. So we have the economic miracle. So the factors that fall under this is the Korean War. The 1950s war in Korea sparks a need for war supplies, but the FRG was banned from producing these, but its industrial goods like chemicals and electrical goods and steel were now in greater demand, where other countries, such as the USA, had shifted to war production. In 1955, the FRG joined NATO and was allowed to rearm and start producing war materials, mainly as a result of the war. New investment. Many businesses has recovered sufficiently by the mid-1950s to be able to invest in more efficiently equipment and even new factories. Concentration on producing high-quality goods and kept their prices as low as possible to compete. The reputation of German goods improved, as well as the exports. As exports grew, so did businesses, and they could invest more and employ more workers, and manufacturers could also buy more materials. Workers. The influx of refugees immediately after the war meant that there was a large pool of guest workers for businesses to draw on. At first, many of these needed training, but once that problem was overcome, they provided an efficient workforce, and that there was a large pool of workers kept below wages low. 1950s, about 3.6 million more workers came to the FRG from the GDR, many of them young, skilled and highly educated, all seeking active work and wanting to become part of West Germany consumer culture, thereby helping the economy twice over. Most of them were employed on the short-term, fixed contracts. The government saved the money that would have been spent on education costs, training people in the FRG, and could use it elsewhere, for example, funding housing construction. Possible problems. Erhard disliked this phrase, economic miracle, because he preferred to see Germany's economic growth as a result of the good economic planning and hard work by the German people. German businesses also did their best for the economy, putting profits back into the business to expand old factories and build new ones. External factors such as the Korean War and the influx of workers from the GDR helped too. There were possible problems, however. Growth could not keep going at a rapid rate of the 1950s and early 60s. Once everyone had bought their consumer goods for the first time, demand fell to a lower level as people replaced these goods at a different time. The Berlin Wall, put up in 1961 by the GDR to cut it off from the FRG, stopped workers crossing from the GDR into the FDR and reduced free professionals that had helped expanding economy. How far did the Federal Republic survive the economic challenges in the year 1966 to 89? Between these years, the FRG experienced a number of economic challenges. Real economic growth had a tendency to vary specifically anyway, but after 1966 it tended to move at a lower rate. During this time, the government, urged by the Law Economics Minister Schiller, began to accent that it had to intervene in the economy, with the Bundesbank managing money supply and a new system of federal and regional budgeting, running alongside particular crises, and then the money taken to deal with them were rising levels of government spending, especially on social welfare. In 1965, the government spent 4.6 million Deutsche Mark on social welfare, and by 1970 this was 115.9 million. This happened despite various cuts to benefits. More encouragingly, the economy was helped by the fact German exports figures stayed healthy thanks to the continued demand, and the fact that Schmidt worked so hard to persuade other world leaders not to introduce protective tariffs during the first oil crisis of 1973. Recession of 1966 to 67. The FRG's first economic recession hit confidence hard. By this time, West Germans saw themselves as economic leaders. Trade, domestic and international, reduced and unemployment increased. Many guest workers were on a one-year renewable contract without social benefits. Guest workers had been vital to economic growth, and they were also vital to managing the effects of the economic crisis. 1966, there were 1.3 of these workers. By September 1967, it decreased to 991,000. Productivity began to fall due to its social welfare policies. The government had been spending more and more. Public spending was spiralling out of control. Erhard was Chancellor and Minister was Schiller, who reorganised the government's approach to the economy. He increased government planning, intervention and control, for example, subsidies for agriculture and the coal industry. He reintroduced cartels and stopped price rising. 1967 Economic Stabilisation Law allowed for the government to intervene in times of economic crisis to limit regional spending, introducing a 5-year plan system for all the government spending. 1968, a provision was provided to the Basic Law that said the federal government could move more money around between the lands, using money from the wealthy ones to provide more social welfare in the struggling ones. Schiller's economic policies were regarded as having failed, as he was replaced with Schmidt in 1972, just in time for the next crisis. The oil crisis of 1973 and 1978. During 1960s and 70s, the FRG came to rely on oil rather than coal as a fuel, and car ownership pushed up petrol consumption. It was the same in many countries. The oil-rich countries of the Middle East grew rich on oil sales, but they had so much oil and that they sold it at an affordable price. 1972, the FRG Economic Development and Policies, 1918 to 89, spent 10.8 billion Deutschmarks on 140 million tons of oil, which changed in 1973 when in October that year the Fourth Arab-Israeli War broke out, and the OPEC put up prices sharply in 1973 and again in 78. The FRG got 40% of its fuel through the OPEC. 140 million tonnes of fuel cost 32.8 billion Deutschmarks in 1973 and 49 again in 1978. This contributed to an economic crisis as it hit the FRG in 74 and 75. Unemployment rose again sharply, made it worse by the fact that the FRG's baby boomers were just hitting the employment market again, and foreign guest workers found that their contracts were not renewed, and a ban was placed on recruiting guest workers. As before, this helped prevent the crisis from getting worse. In fact, the FRG was not hit as hard as some other countries, as it had helped by its export income, and once again the economy recovered rapidly. Oil consumption dropped partly because of the government measures such as encouraging car-free Sundays and introducing speed limits and auto bans in order to save fuel. Government propaganda pushed back energy tactics in homes and industries, and the government also began to invest in some serious atomic power to reduce the dependency on oil. The biggest push to this cut in consumption was that the government did not subsidise oil prices but just let them rise in line with their actual costs, making it expensive and encouraged cutbacks. German industries converted to new fuels much more rapidly than in any other country. The government also brought back in public spending cuts and higher income tax in 1975. So we now have integration into the European economy. So the Allies included the western zones of Germany in their organisations that were set up to try and rebuild Europe, for example, the OEEC. From then, the FRG was set up. Chancellor Adenauer was concerned to establish closer ties with Europe and to be accepted as part of Europe. He saw political and economic integration with the rest of Europe as vital for a German economy and political success. He was especially concerned to build a close working relationship with France. This end, he was far more concerned about establishing trade. Other agreements with the Europe than achieving unification with the GDR. Challenges to the 1980s. The 1980s, the gap between the rich and the poorest widened in Germany. This created friction, for example, hostility towards guest workers. The FRG had ridden out the crisis of the 1970s better than some other countries, largely due to its healthy exports. 1978, West Germany even exported more to the OPEC countries than it imported. Even though much of the rest of the world was in recession, Germany's total exports continued to rise and stay consistently ahead of its imports. However, it never regained the economic heights of the 1960s, and real growth in economy shrank as prices, which Germany had kept under control, began to rise with inflation. Unemployment hit 1.7 million in 1981, the highest amount since 1950. This drove up the amount of spending on unemployment benefits and assistance for long-term unemployed. The 1981 government public spending, including benefits and housing allowance, was deeply unpopular, especially with those who felt Germany should return to social market economy. There were arguments in the Bundestag about whether to create more work by reducing the working week or to set up job share programs to get more unemployed people back into at least part-time work. Changing in living standards 1945 to 89. Living standards went a huge change from this period. In 1945, war damage meant that families were torn apart, people were starving and many people were homeless. About a fifth of all housing had been bombed and about a third of that still standing was damaged. Refugee influx led to even more pressures on housing. Housing and food were the most pressures of the late 1940s and the first few years of the 1950s. A Ministry of Housing was set up to oversee rebuilding. Rents were frozen and building industry were given tax concessions to build. Housing industries were set up to build homes. Some state-run social housing for workers in the state-run industries, whilst others were privately run. Spending patterns. As the economy strengthened, so did the standing of living rose, and people began to spend their monies on different things, mainly on consumer goods. 1963, 60% of homes had a fridge, 42% had a TV, and 36% had a washing machine. By 85, these percentages were 82, 82, and 87. All through the period, real wages kept on rising ahead of prices, even though the extent by which they were ahead varied. By 1980s, about 90% of all people here covered by benefits and healthcare. Pensions reformed in 1918s mean that people received a state pension, on average 12 years longer than people in 1950. However, social inequality had deepened. Even with the affluent 1960s, when the economy was at its best, 1% of all households owned 35% of its wealth. In 1973, the Rudd percentage of all households owned 78% of wealth, while in 1988 they owned 45%.